One of the things that I am most interested in is Christian history, specifically the origins of Christianity. Like, I'm so fascinated by that particular field of study. As you can tell with all of the content that I do surrounding the historicity of Jesus, but it's really more than just the historicity of Jesus, because I am on a quest to learn more and more about Christian origins. I want to know how Christianity came about, how it developed, and all of the subtle nuances and all of the factors that went into the rise of one of the most popular religions of all time. One of the topics encased in this quest is how we can know if Jesus said anything. So, for the purposes of this particular video that we're going to be reviewing today, I'm going to assume that, sure, Jesus existed in history. Now, how can we know what Jesus actually said? That is a difficult question to answer, and that's why it's so intriguing to me, because it's difficult. I know a lot of you out there are more concerned with whether or not magic exists. I don't know why, but I get that. I'm more interested in history and what we can know about history, specifically Christian origins. Part of that is, what did Jesus say? Well, today we've got Dr. William Lane Craig here to tell us how we can know what Jesus actually said and how we can know that those quotes that are in red letters in your Bible are actually quotes from Jesus himself. So if you want to fuck around and find out what Jesus literally said in history, then why you can take that as a fact, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're taking a look at Dr. William Lane Craig saying some really stupid shit about how we can know what Jesus actually said. And I know, I'm a mythicist, so I don't believe Jesus said a fucking thing. So obviously, the red letters in the Bible are the sections that are highlighted to suggest that Jesus literally said those things. I don't think that those were literally said by a Jesus in history that then got recorded down. But for the purposes of this video, I am willing to accept Jesus as a historical figure so that we can move past that discussion, because that discussion really has no bearing on what William Lane Craig's about to say. All of the stupid shit that he's about to say is going to come from mainstream academic sources. So you can be assured that Dr. William Lane Craig is wrong by any measure of history in this video. Now, enough with spoiling it for y'all. Let's get to it.
When we ask what confidence we can have that the disciples, or the authors of the New Testament, rather, got the words of Jesus accurately, I assume the question is independent of divine inspiration. Without appealing to divine inspiration, what warrant would there be?
Yes, please. I would love some real physical evidence or historical evidence, even just textual evidence that actually exists in reality. None of this magical telepathic bullshit that apparently a wizard transmitted through his brainwaves to you. What, does the wizard have a brain? Does God have a brain? Not really sure how that works, but it's telepathy and it's magical as shit. We do not mean magical evidence. We mean real evidence. Thank you so much for clarifying, Dr. Craig.
For thinking that they got the words of Jesus accurately. And here I think one would appeal to the historical credibility of these biographies of Jesus.
Okay, so just, I know I stopped him real quick, but the Gospels are not biographies. Very obviously, they're not biographies. So I get that he thinks that they're biographies, but as far as like real historians go and critical New Testament scholars, they are not histories. They're not written like histories. They may be written in a sort of a tone of what's supposed to be like a historical narrative, but they're definitely not histories, because they differ from histories in a lot of different aspects, even historical biographies like he's trying to make it out to be. You see, typically historical biographies or histories in general will discuss their sources, explain why those sources are the best sources to use, and even talk about how they are going to reconcile certain contradictions that exist within their sources and why they would choose one source over another. We don't get any of this from any of the Gospels. The closest that we get is Luke, which he is going to get into here in a minute. Luke attempts attempts to do this, he only feigns trying to present it as some kind of history instead of actually presenting an actual history. Luke vaguely mentions that he collected stories that were previously written, so we do know that Luke at least admits that there are other sources that he's using, but where he differs from actual historical biographies or narratives or histories in general is that he doesn't actually discuss who his sources are. The best example that you can use in order to starkly contrast the Gospels with historical biographies or histories in general is the account of Alexander the Great by Arrian. Arrian has an entire section devoted to his sources, where he discusses what sources he uses. Most notably, he uses two of Alexander the Great's generals and firsthand accounts from them, which Arrian had access to, yet we do not have access to those now. So Arrian had access to firsthand accounts of Alexander the Great amongst all of the other sources that he employed. That's where it seriously differs when concerning the gospel. So what Dr. Craig is saying here is that he's in the fringe of scholarship, and he considers the Gospels to be biographies when nobody else does, except for apologists and educated apologists or New Testament scholars that are very biased towards their Christian background.
Take just one example, the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke is the first half of a two-part work. The second half is the Acts of the Apostles. And the Acts of the Apostles overlap significantly with the secular history of the ancient world.
Actually, Acts does not. Well, I mean, that wouldn't exactly be true. Acts does overlap with secular history when concerned with the sources that Luke pulls from in order to add sort of a local background to his story. And that would be mentioning popular people at the time, government officials and all that kind of stuff, places, groups that existed at the time, like those types of things. If that is what he's considering secular history, then I would agree that Luke does get those things right. Of course, there are times when Luke gets some things wrong as far as geography goes, and we know that he is pulling from these secular sources rather than the secular sources using Luke or some kind of weird thing like that, because Luke gets these things wrong in the same ways that the secular sources like Josephus gets wrong. We've got pretty substantial reasons and evidence to think that Luke was actually using some of Josephus's work in order to add some of this local background sort of detailed information to his story. So in that particular aspect, sure, he gets those things right. But I feel like if you were to make this argument, then you would also have to agree that Harry Potter's fucking real, because in Harry Potter, there's a lot of background information that places Harry in our reality, in our world at least, or at least a reality that closely resembles our reality. You would have to also agree that Harry Potter is real, or at least possibly a biography of a young wizard who survived, another wizard trying to kill his ass. I mean, I guess Harry Potter's a true story now. It's a history. Harry Potter's a history written by a transphobe.
And affords the possibility, therefore, of independent confirmation of what Luke says.
No, this would be an example of a composition fallacy. Composition fallacy is basically when you take a smaller subset of a larger set. In this particular case, the smaller set of things would be the items that the author of Luke gets correct in the background information of his stories. The larger set would be the Gospel of Luke and Acts. So what William Lane Craig is doing here is he's taking the smaller set of items and then he's applying his conclusion to the larger set of items. So because Luke got these few incidental small things correct, that means that the entire tome of Luke and Acts is also historically accurate. This is a classic composition fallacy. You can't actually say that the smaller set therefore makes the larger set as accurate as the smaller set.
And when you look at this in detail over and over and over again, Luke's accuracy in the book of Acts is historically confirmed.
Well, That was a complete load of horse shit right there. There are a number of ways in which Acts totally contradicts our historical evidence. And I've got a whole long list, so buckle up because we're going to take a really quick top-level view of how fucked up Acts is when it's concerned with history. First of all, Acts gets Paul's theology wrong. One example of this would be whether or not Timothy was circumcised, because Acts seems to envision that Timothy decided to cut the tip of his penis off, whereas Paul only ever knew Timothy as a Gentile. He was never a Jew, and so therefore never needed to cut the tip of his dick off. Never thought I'd be talking about Timothy's dick tip. Acts also fabricates a number of its stories using sources that were available to the author, like Homer's works, the Aeneid, the Book of Ezekiel, and then in 1st and 2nd Kings, the Elisha and Elijah narratives. Acts seems to fabricate a parallel between Peter and Paul, which to me seems to put both of them on equal footing, which seems to contradict something that Paul said in 1 Corinthians when he said that he was born like as a lesser apostle, or he was lesser than the other apostles. Of course, that's due to his persecution of Christians at first and then coming around to Jesus later. But the ways in which Peter and Paul are paralleled to put them on an equal footing include raising someone from the dead, healing a paralytic, healing by magical means, beating a sorcerer, and then escaping prison. Acts even has Paul exceeding all of the feats of Jesus. Both of them had long journeys where they walked around, bummed off people, and preached. These journeys culminated in a long last journey to Jerusalem, where each of them were arrested for fucking up a temple, and each were acquitted by the Roman and Herodian 5-0. Jews then plotted against both of them, but they're both found innocent, but both are also interrogated by the Jewish 5-0. And finally, both know that their death was foretold and then made predictions about what would occur after they died. Additionally, in Acts, Peter's sermon to the Jews in Jerusalem makes no sense as history. And finally, Acts' depiction of Stephen's trial contradicts known court procedures of the Sanhedrin at that time. If you want to know more about how Acts is historical fiction and in no way represents real history, I'll have a link down below to several sources that you can check out for yourself.
And this gives us real confidence that this author named Luke is a careful historian, and that therefore when it comes to the accounts of Jesus' life, which are more private and don't overlap as much significantly with secular world history, that Luke gets it right there as well.
Again, I feel like this is more of a composition fallacy. He is again saying, oh, well, Luke can get these small items right over here, and so therefore he gets everything right about what Jesus said. This is taking a smaller set and then applying it to the larger set. Also, he's assuming here that more of the Luke Acts narrative is correct than actually is. And he's not really addressing any of the conflicts between the author of Luke and Paul. Additionally, he said that this author of Luke seems to be a careful historian, which we know that that's not true. As I stated before, Arrian, in his biography of Alexander the Great, actually goes over all of the sources that he used and engages directly with, the sources at times in his histories. And he also discusses how he's going to resolve contradictions that appear in his sources. So we don't find any of that from the Gospel of Luke. The author of Luke definitely was not a careful historian. If he were a careful historian, he wouldn't have used so many literary devices and literary techniques in his stories. He would have just written them as histories instead of narratives. I've actually discussed how poor of a historical work Luke is before, and so I will also have that linked down below. It's on my Godless Engineer Clips channel, so go down there, watch the video, subscribe if you think it provides you with some really good information and you like seeing smaller clips of me.
Moreover, we can also show that specific sayings of Jesus meet certain so-called criteria of authenticity.
The criteria of authenticity is rather poor, especially when employed by New Testament scholars. These New Testament scholars think that, oh, because something's embarrassing to me personally, or I can envision it being embarrassing to the Jews, then that obviously is something that really happened in history. There's a lot of subjectiveness to this criteria. I personally would rather use like evidence and arguments to the best explanation and things of that nature. And actually using historical criteria for establishing things that happened in history. This criteria of authenticity was actually invented in New Testament scholarship in order to prove things that were historical in the Bible, not to really be employed elsewhere in history. It really specifically is mostly used here in New Testament studies. And what I meant by invented earlier was that they invent some of these criterion. Some of these criterion are really only used in New Testament studies. There might be some semblance of some of these criteria being used elsewhere in history, but I can guarantee you that these uses elsewhere in history either have more information tacked onto them, or these are supplementary information that only helps support other stronger criteria.
That, for example, they are multiply and independently attested in the sources for the historical Jesus.
I'm going to need a citation for this. There's multiple ways that you can interpret what he's saying here as far as the sources that inform the histories. Most notably, a lot of people cite like QML. There's a whole bunch of other hypothetical sources that you could use here. And I'll just speak on hypothetical sources, like using hypothetical sources. You can't say that they're independent. Hypothetical sources are non-existent. If they did exist at one point in history, there's no way that we can know what was actually in them. So it's really pointless to even bring them up. It's even more pointless to already identify them as being independent. Of course, Dr. William Lane Craig here considers the Gospels to be independent eyewitness accounts in and of themselves. What he's saying here probably is not mentioning Q, M, or L, because that's farther into the critical space than Dr. William Lane Craig is actually willing to go. He's more along the lines of educated apologist, right? So what he's probably talking about is Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, all of them being eyewitness accounts, all of them being written by the eyewitnesses themselves, which has a lot of complications factored into it. So we're not going to cover all of that here. We actually don't know who wrote the Gospels. We know that it's not the people that appear in the titles, because those were tacked on later. That's the mainstream view of the titles that are tacked on to the Gospels. I would just need some kind of citation as to what he means by these multiply attested independent accounts. Even in the Gospels, Jesus doesn't always say the exact same thing. They're very different at multiple points in the Gospels. So while there may be some overlap in some of the things that Jesus says, there are very big differences in the things that Jesus says, but that can be easily explained by the fact that each gospel was just copying the previous gospel. All the way back to Mark. Mark being the first gospel written, he was copying off of what Paul said and what Paul wrote in his letters. Mark being the one to maybe not fabricate what Jesus said at first. Mark definitely had other sources, but at some point somebody had to fabricate dialogue for Jesus. We know that Mark regularly used things that Paul said and put them in the mouth of Jesus, therefore making Jesus say some things that Paul had already said previously. But the curious thing there is that Paul doesn't actually identify that information as coming from Jesus. That was personal opinion coming from Paul. These are irreconcilable things in the context of what Dr. William Lane Craig is talking about here.
Or that they would be embarrassing or awkward for the early Christian church, and therefore are unlikely to have been made up or invented, but do represent authentic words of Jesus.
So my problem with this is, how does he know what would be embarrassing to the first century Jews or Jewish Christians? Because it seems like, considering all the editing that's happened to the Gospels, like, for instance, Mark originally never had any post-resurrection appearances except for the one where he scared the shit out of the women that came and found the tomb empty. That was a problem, right? That was an embarrassing fact for the rest of the Gospels and for the rest of Christendom at the time. And so what somebody in the second century did was go back and added extra passages to Mark in order to have a post-resurrection appearance. That's an example of something that was embarrassing and then got fixed later. So if something persisted through all of the edits that we know to have occurred in history, then it seems like it wasn't really all that embarrassing. It seems like those things that Craig is calling embarrassing, which we don't know exactly what he's saying is embarrassing. One of the things that I think I've heard him say is that women finding the tomb is an embarrassing fact for the time. But in the Gospels, the concept of the least shall be first is pushed heavily. And the least in this position, as far as Dr. Craig is concerned, would be women, as considered by Jewish society as being lesser than men. In this particular instance, this doesn't actually mesh with anything that we know about Jewish culture at the time. Women's testimony weren't treated as lesser than a man's. I mean, obviously we have some misogyny in Judaism, from the scriptures. As far as whether or not the testimony of women was trusted, like in the courts of law and everything like that, we actually have evidence to the contrary, that women were often trusted in court. And any reasons as to why women wouldn't be allowed in court wasn't because they were untrustworthy or they, couldn't be relied upon. It was more of a cultural decorum thing, like it was unseemly for women to be seen in court. But women were regularly called, their testimonies were regularly used. None of this actually meshes with what we know about Jewish culture. And with the fact that Christianity was itself a fringe idea that was breaking away from Jewish culture, I don't know why they would introduce this kind of criteria to say, oh, this definitely happened because it was contrary to what Jews would believe. And that's just simply not true for the Jews, for one, but also it's not true for a group that was splintering away from the Jews that already held starkly contradicting ideas from the mainstream Jews at the time. So all in all, the criterion of embarrassment is embarrassing.
Or that they're very dissimilar to both the Jewish background out of which the New Testament emerged, and also to the beliefs of the New Testament church. And that again gives us good reason to think that these words are authentic.
I would love for him to provide some evidence for this, because like I just discussed, these things that he says are contradictory to how they would believe has a number of problems. We don't know what would have been embarrassing to these early Christians or these first century Jews. Later Christians developed wild ideas about Jesus. Like there was one in the infancy narratives, the infancy gospels, where Jesus kills a kid and then resurrects him, and he does other kind of fucked up, really psychotic shit. There was also another Christian group out there that had this story of Jesus where he took Mary Magdalene up on top of a mountain and then proceeded to pull a woman out of his side and proceeded to grape the woman right in front of Mary. And then when he climaxed inside of this newly formed woman after he graped her, he reached in, pulled out his ejaculate and, held it up and was like, do this in remembrance of me or something or another like that. And but this was all in order to justify some weird sex practices that particular cult had. Christians developed really weird ideas, and I don't understand why Craig or anybody else would claim that these ideas espoused by Jesus were just so radical that it can only be true as far as a true fact of history. That's one thing, but also the New Testament authors had so many chances to change embarrassing facts. We even listed one of them, that being the lack of post-resurrection appearances in Mark. They changed that. If there was something that was truly embarrassing, then I would think that they would change those things as well. It just doesn't really sit well with me, this whole idea of just sort of throwing your hands up in the air and being like, well, this shit embarrasses me, and I think it would embarrass them, and my misconceptions of Jewish culture seems to lend credence to this idea that, yeah, they should be embarrassed by those things too, so obviously this shit's real. This whole idea does have a parallel in our modern legal system, and that would be statements against interest. But statements against interest are considered very weak evidence and are only admitted if they have corroborating evidence to actually add to the credibility of this statement against interest. Which leads me to another problem with this whole idea. There is as much reason to fabricate these quote-unquote embarrassing statements as there is for relaying them as part of history. There is as much reason to fabricate these quote-unquote embarrassing facts or embarrassing things as there is for reporting them as actual facts of history. It's pretty much just a washout on the likelihood that any of these are actual true facts of history, because they could just as easily be fabricated in order to give the account more of an air of accuracy because they're making statements against interest.
And so the combination of this general historical reliability plus these criteria of authenticity for specific sayings, I think gives us real confidence that the New Testament authors did indeed get right the claims that the historical Jesus made.
I mean, sure, if you're an educated apologist, these are very good tools to use in order to convince your audience of the bullshit that you're talking about. If you take a closer look at all of this and you actually reasonably engage in the evidence and take into consideration all of the information that would factor into these criteria of authenticity, then you'll see how it quickly falls apart. It's definitely a house that's built on a mound of sand rather than a firm foundation. And I feel like Dr. William Lane Craig is just so entrenched in his bias towards the Christian religion that it can only ever make sense to him, this criterion of authenticity, like the criteria of embarrassment. There's also this one criterion called the Aramaic criteria. Basically, if there is some phrase or sentence or something said by Jesus that either appears in Aramaic or makes better sense in Aramaic than it originally was in Aramaic and then got translated into Greek, but because it originated in Aramaic, Jesus most likely said it. This would only work if Jesus was the only motherfucker walking around speaking Aramaic, or that he spoke Aramaic on occasion amongst people that just did not speak Aramaic. But Aramaic was the actual common tongue at the time. A lot of people at this time were bilingual. That doesn't mean that they could read and write, obviously. That was a wholly separate skill set that had to be learned in certain schools at the time. Pagan schools, mind you, which is why a lot of pagan ideas and pagan stories show up in the Gospels, by the way. Aramaic was a pretty common tongue at the time, so it's highly unlikely Jesus was the only one that could speak Aramaic at the time and that he was the only one speaking Aramaic to other people. So it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And this is replicated over all of the criterions that they use in order to establish historical facts. And it's not just educated apologists like Dr. William Lane Craig. It's also critical New Testament scholars that engage with some of these criterion as well. Just because they use it doesn't mean that William Lane Craig here is right when he uses the criterion of embarrassment. But that's it for his video today. I was not at all impressed by it. I found his reasoning to be really simplistic. Of course, he wasn't giving us very specific information. He wasn't making a very in-depth and well-formed argument. This was more of a really quick, top-level, a broad view of how one would argue for the authenticity of Jesus's words in the Bible. But I feel like even from a broad view of it, like a surface level engagement in this topic, you can see how bad the actual evidence is to support those things. I mean, this would be a great video if it was supported by evidence, but it isn't. There just simply isn't evidence to support any of the claims that William Lane Craig made in this video. This is a dud for me, and I hope that it's a dud for you. Even if you're a Christian, you should not be happy with this video because nothing that William Lane Craig said in this video is accurate in the least bit. Let me know down below what you thought about William Lane Craig's video. Do you think that he made some solid arguments here? Do you think that he needs to say more? Do you think that he needs to provide evidence like I think that he needs to do? Let me know down below in the comments. And while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.